right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Devin Lau and I'm the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing. We are very excited to have everybody join us today. For those of you guys that are new here, Yale Center Beijing has been around for quite some years now. We were established in 2014, and of course, pre-pandemic, we had lots of live talks in the center of the business district of Beijing. But ever since the pandemic, we've shifted onto Zoom. And as I was just talking with our speaker today, for the better in some cases, because many of you would not have been able to join us otherwise. So special welcome to all of you that are joining us for the first time. We love to host talks featuring Yale professors as well as thought leaders from around the world. And we've joined with Yale University Press to feature some of their newest books. And so today, the speaker will be sharing from her newest book from Yale University Press, A Little History of Art, which is a wonderful read for those of you guys that are interested. And she'll be focusing on some of the works that she discusses in her book today. And hopefully after today's talk, you guys will be ready to commit to buying the book. Let me give you a quick introduction to our speaker. Charlotte Mullins. She is an art critic, writer, and broadcaster, as well as the newly appointed art critic for Country Life. She's worked as the arts editor of The Independent on Sunday, the editor of Art Review, the V&A magazine, as well as the Art Quarterly. She is a regular contributor to BBC Radio, and she studied at the Cortland Institute of Art and Sotheby's Institute in London, as well as the University of Sussex. She's written over 10 books, 2 of which are art books for children, and she published under the pen name Charlie Ayers. So quite a broad resume there, and very fun as well. So I'm excited to hear from her today. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping note. For those of you guys that are able to, we would ask that you please turn on your webcams. Of course, you know, in the time of Zoom, I think we're all used to talking to a computer screen, but it's always nice to be talking to at least some faces instead of just a screen of random names. So please, for the sake of the speaker, to make her feel more welcome, please turn on your webcams if you're able to. And so with that, I will turn it over to our speaker today.
Thank you very much, Devin. Hello, everybody. My name is Charlotte Mullins. I'm going to talk to you today about some alternative histories of art. So Devin's very kindly introduced my book. And although the book is called A Little History of Art, what I've tried to do is expand that idea of art and produce something more up to date that shows there are lots of different ways to look at art. I'm going to share my screen to show you all some slides. Don't panic, the first screen is black. And there's a reason for that. So I'm going to share it and then I'll explain. So the reason for giving the first slide as black is so I'm going to read you a little bit from the very introduction of the book. And I just want you to try and imagine yourself there where the scene of the action is. I want you to imagine you're in a long winding passageway deep within a cave system in southern France. It's 17,000 years ago. In front of you, a person holds a burning torch and you follow behind, glancing at the engravings of bison and reindeer carved into the walls. Together, you head to the furthest point in the cave system, over half a kilometre from the entrance. There, balancing on your heels so your feet don't get stuck in the mud, you squat down and cut a clay slab from the damp floor. Slowly, you help transform the soft material into 2 sculptures, 2 bison, each the length of an arm. The bison follow the contours of the rock, but stand proud of the surface, the male rearing up behind the female. They seem to come to life before your eyes, their manes standing up on their necks, their tails twitching in the flickering torchlight. We don't know who made these bison, and we don't know why. 2 sets of heel prints in the clay floor tell us there were 2 artists. One was a teenager, and the other a mature adult. Were these bison created as a rite of passage to adulthood, or were they part of a fertility ritual? What we do know is that these bison are early examples of art's power, its magic. Since prehistoric times, art has helped us express ourselves and navigate our place in the world. It has this incredible power to speak to our emotions directly, to speak to us beyond words. Art has been made for thousands of years and is far older than writing. It was one of the earliest forms with which to communicate beyond the everyday, a way of considering ideas bigger than us. It's been made in every country, by every ethnicity, and by every gender, although it hasn't always seemed this way in the history books. So you can see my little history of art on top of 3 earlier examples, slightly larger ones. And despite these their size, these earlier books on art history often ignored whole areas of art. For example, Gombrich's Story of Art only famously had 1 woman artist in the entire book. My little history of art, by comparison, has big ambitions. It explores the contradictory, complex fizzing centers of art across the world and through time. It shows that art has always been a network that stretches beyond borders, generations, class, and gender. And it shines a light, I hope, on forgotten or overlooked artists and celebrates art in all its forms. So I'm going to try and give you a flavor of this today. And where more fitting to begin than in ancient China? So each chapter in the book is accompanied by a lino cut print by British illustrator Matt Pringle, and each chapter in the book takes you back in time to the very spot where art is made. I want to give you a sense of these chapter openers. So we're going to join Emperor Qin's workforce over 2,000 years ago. I'm just going to read a short extract from the book. The year is 210 BCE, and the ruthless Chinese Emperor Qin has just died. An army has amassed to guide him to the afterlife, and thousands now stand in ordered ranks. There are archers and officers, infantry and cavalry, all facing the lands Qin conquered as he united the whole of China under his banner. The Imperial Guard stands 4 abreast in 10 seemingly endless columns, spears in hand to guard against attack. This army never sleeps, for these are no ordinary soldiers, but life-size painted replicas made from terracotta or clay. They are part of a vast mausoleum that the emperor first ordered to be built when he took power as a regional king of the state of Qin, aged just 13. 36 years later, the army now guards a replica of Qin's capital city that includes his palace, where his body has been laid to rest. Passageways connect the entombed palace to the rest of the duplicate city, which stretches for miles. Bronze chariots are parked in pits with bronze horses in full harness and a coachman ever ready to drive the dead emperor around. Terracotta musicians and acrobats are on hand for entertainment. Replicas of Qin's courtiers and employees mill about, ready to offer service. Clay geese and swans swim on an underground lake, so the emperor will never run out of food. This terracotta army was only rediscovered in 1974. They think now 1,000 people, over 1,000 people made these figures. They used centralized materials so the figures had the same consistency, and they cast the same body parts but put them together differently. So in the example we have on the right, you can see that although their bodies are similar, their faces and their top knots are very different. These figures were then painted, so they would look as lifelike as possible. So they wouldn't look all like the same cast figure, but would actually look like people guarding the emperor. Qin had united China for the first time, but this new country had already started to trade with others using early trade routes. And ideas and supplies moved both ways along this route. This route we of course now know as the Silk Road. If we just look at the path on the right, from India up to China, that's the route I'm going to talk about briefly now. Indian Buddhism spread along this route. Temples were built at various way stations along the way, and Buddhist monasteries and halls for worship were hewn out of the cliffs. So first I'm going to show you an example from India. So you can see around the half-kilometer river, the Ajanta caves just northeast of Mumbai have been cut literally into the side of the rock. I mean, imagine how long that must have taken. And in all these temples, they would be filled with sculpture and painting. We see a small example on the right from cave 17, which is the best preserved. And you can see a procession in place with elephants and horses. These were scenes from the Jataka, the popular stories of Buddha's former lives. By the time this cave was finished in the 5th century CE, Buddhism had spread to China. And I'm sure you all know the most famous example in China are the Mogao cave complex at Dunhuang. a city on the Silk Road. So just after you get through the desert from India, you would reach Dunhuang. Here, there are not 30 caves, there are 500 caves, nearly 500 caves, in a 1 kilometer stretch of cliffs filled with Buddhist murals. Initially, the influence of the Indian caves dominated, and they also had scenes from the Jataka. But from the 6th century, we get to see new developments in Chinese painting. For example, in the large picture I'm showing you, you can see the Buddha sitting in a landscape that stretches back, almost like we're looking at him from above. Writing about art in China has a long and illustrious history, but art history is a relatively new discipline in the West. It wasn't really formalized until the 18th century and was built around ideas of progress and development, with classical mimesis as the ultimate goal. Art challenged this premise in the 19th century, but only in the last few decades has art history itself been scrutinized and challenged in the West. I have to admit, though, it's still tricky to fit some Chinese artists into books structured in a Western way around chronology because of the long time frames. For example, the literati tradition, which existed for 1,000 years. I did put literati artists in the book, but I had to choose just one example, and I chose the art couple Zhao Mengfu and Guan Daosheng from the 13th century. Zhao was an artist and court official, and he was persuaded to join the Mongol administration in 1286, the year he married Guan, who was an artist in her own right. And this is a detail from Guan's bamboo groves in Mist and Rain from 1308. I became particularly interested in her, how she enjoyed the support and patronage from men and women at court, and how she worked alongside her husband on poetry, calligraphy, and paintings, the 3 pursuits of the literati. She's credited with inventing the tradition of painting bamboo on riverbanks, which is what we can see in the scroll in front of us, bamboo growing alongside the edge of a river with a swathe of what looks like low-lying fog in the middle, but actually is created by just leaving that part of the scroll blank. The scroll, of course, would be unrolled from the right to the left, and we'd follow on this journey, this very meditative journey. The literati would all load meaning into these delicate monochrome landscapes, and bamboo could embody a desire for endurance, to bend without breaking. So we're going to go back in time a little from Guan, and then we're only going to go forwards in time. We're going to go back to another ancient civilization and consider ancient Rome through a broader lens than normally is apparent. My favorite sculpture from ancient Rome has to be the Laocoon, and there are 2 reasons for this. I mean, first, just look at it. This is full of energy and high drama. Look at the muscle definition on the legs, the lats on the chest, the veins on his arms, and the way the face is expressing absolute torment. I don't know if you can see, but actually Laocoon, the priest in the center, and his twin sons are being bitten by sea snakes. The reason for this, Laocoon was sentenced to death by a vengeful god for trying to warn his besieged city of Troy not to accept the Greek gift of a giant wooden horse. Laocoon unfortunately died. He was attacked, and at that time Greek soldiers poured out of the belly of the horse and captured Troy and won the war. This sculpture was lost for over 1,000 years and only rediscovered during the Renaissance in 1506. It was discovered under a vineyard in Rome, and the Pope sent Michelangelo to take a look at it, immediately bought it, and you can see this sculpture today in the Vatican in Rome. The other reason I like it, beyond it being a stunning piece of sculpture, is because it gets to the nub of the difficulty when looking at Roman art. This is about dating. Stylistically, this could be from the 3rd century BCE, but some experts believe it's 200 years later. And Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, seems to date it 100 years after that. So why is this? The reason is because Romans didn't differentiate between an original work of art and a copy. They wanted ancient Greek sculptures, but there weren't enough around, so they had to copy them. Rome grew from a small town to an imperial superpower with 1 million people living in the city, and the appetite for sculpture was voracious. So copies were made of the most famous works and shipped to Rome. The works we can see here, on the left, you can see the spear thrower of Polyclitus. There are 65 known copies of this, Roman copies. The original was a bronze work, a Greek work from the 5th century BCE, but this is a marble Roman copy. And on the right, this would have been seen as a Roman Venus, but is a copy of the Greek Aphrodite. And there are literally thousands of these being found in Rome. Greece was all about this ideal body type, this ideal, but Romans were also interested in portraiture. We don't often see women in sculptures from this period, but this is a portrait of Plancia Magna. Portraits were important for capturing a person's likeness for posterity, of course, and marking their importance. And Plancia Magna was the highest ranking government official, and she was a powerful figure in Perge. Perge was in Turkey, but was part of the Roman Empire. And her family were Roman citizens, so they sat in the Senate in Rome, but they were also part of the Perge elite. Plancia Magna paid for the city's gates in Perge to be refurbished. And so this sculpture was erected in her honor, slightly larger than life size. It shows her with a crown, a diadem on her head, and marks her out as a priestess of the imperial cult. There's also an inscription around the bottom saying she was the daughter of the city and worked for the good of the people. It wasn't just wealthy women who were depicted in Rome, but you could also see less powerful women remembered on tomb sculptures. So the quality, of course, is not quite as defined. But the woman on the left, we can see, is selling flowers and vegetables from a market stall. And the woman on the right, she's called Scribonia Attica, and she's shown in her role as a practicing midwife, actually helping someone give birth as she's dead in her tomb. Western art histories often begin with sculptures from ancient Greece and Rome. It sort of indicates the classical pinnacle of art that Western art history is founded on. The idea that we trick the eye and make lifelike sculptures and paintings that look like windows onto other worlds. But in my book, I really wanted to point out there are other narratives than just the Western art history narrative. And these narratives run parallel to this version of art history. One such narrative is the history of African art. This work on the right is a Nok sculpture from around 2,000 years ago. As Chin was building his empire, the Nok culture was flourishing in West Africa, north of the Niger River in what's now Nigeria. And from the map, you can see where these sculptures have been found. They're hollow, they're made from terracotta, coiled ropes of clay. As they were drying out, the details were cut into them. So textured necklaces, we can see on this example, hair braids. They also had really stylized faces, so very arched eyebrows, triangular eyes, and their mouths and eyes would be drilled so the air could vent from inside when the sculpture was fired to prevent it from cracking. Some of these Nok sculptures stood at 1 meter tall, but they only really exist now in fragments. And that's because there's a belief that these sculptures were purposefully destroyed or at least broken when they were used to mark a funeral or commemorate an ancestor. The Nok left no written records. So this art, I feel, is doubly important because it reveals the details of the lives of these ancient cultures. In this example, you can see there's a seashell on the head of this sculpture. Another one has an armlet in the shape of a pharaoh's crook. And these give indications that the Nok had a really substantial trade network that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to Egypt in the east. The history of art in Africa is very rich. 1,500 years later, also now in modern Nigeria, but in the state of Benin, artists preferred to work in bronze. They'd worked this way since the 13th century, and you may well know these works as the Benin bronzes today. Benin artists were highly valued. They had their own city guilds and lived on Igon Street, close to the king's palace. They made hundreds of wall plaques that hung on the pillars of the palace, the king's palace. The king was called the Oba. So we'll have a look at the Oba here. Yeah, you can just see 4 examples of him in this slide. I took these photographs in the British Museum, but the Benin bronzes occur all over the world at the moment. The first thing I think you notice about the Oba, he's the central figure in these plaques, is that he's larger than everybody else. This is to make you know that he's the most important figure there. The next thing you notice is that he's heavily armed. He always carries a spear or a club. He has leopard claws around his plated helmet and round his neck. So this is not a man to be messed with. And quite a lot of these plaques recorded important battles. They also recorded meetings between other cultures, even between the Benin people and the Portuguese. The Portuguese had traveled from Europe and by 1520 had established trade links with West Africa. And actually, if we look at this example, we can see a Portuguese merchant standing tall with his skinny spear, his very slim nose, his long straight hair, his beard, very different from how the oba is presented. He's in a tight-fitting jerkin with a pleated skirt, and he stands here and in many of the other plaques to show that these important meetings happened. I was really keen to discuss the Benin bronzes when they were first made around the 15th and 16th century in the book, but I also couldn't ignore the moment when they entered Western art history for the first time. This was when they were looted by British forces in 1897. I'm going to let the book explain and read you another example from the book. On 9th of February 1897, British troops arrived at the Niger Delta in West Africa. They disembarked and proceeded towards Benin City. A small British raiding party had been murdered by Benin City guards a month earlier, and this new attack was a vastly inflated retaliation. The British were armed with rocket launchers and machine guns, and they annihilated the Edo soldiers who fought back from the surrounding trees. Ultimately, Benin City was captured and its royal palace complex burned to the ground after being systematically looted of all its treasures. There was no archaeological cataloguing of the sculptures before they were removed from shrines or plaques from storehouses. Rather, they were gathered in courtyards and divvied up according to Western ideas of value, with the most ornate works reserved for Queen Victoria, such as a pair of ivory leopards inlaid with copper spots. The most complex plaques were taken back to the Colonial Office in London to be sold to help finance the expedition. 2/3 of these plaques entered the collection of the British Museum, and an exhibition was held there 7 months later. When people saw the bronzes, they were amazed. Europeans didn't think African art was so sophisticated or technically advanced. At this time, African art wasn't even considered art at all. It was labelled primitive and filed away in ethnographic museums. But the Benin bronzes made it obvious that a high level of artistry had developed in Africa, independent of Western art. It turned out Africa had its own art history. The Benin bronzes were the continent's masterpieces, and the British had just stolen them. African art appears throughout the book, from the earliest known paint retrieved from the Blombos cave in South Africa 100,000 years ago to the work of contemporary artists Zanile Moholi and Yinka Shonibari. Even art historical periods we think we know well, such as the European Renaissance, benefit from reassessment and expansion. A Little History of Art includes the artists you will have heard of, I'm sure. Oh, sorry, this was a photograph of the lute, the Benin lute. So here are the artists you will have heard of, I'm sure. This is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa and Michelangelo's giant sculpture of David. And here's a work by Raphael. 3 Renaissance artists we know so well, we know them only by their first names, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael. In this painting, I think I can show you, this is Raphael included Michelangelo's portrait. I'm just circling it with the cursor now. He also included Leonardo's portrait back here, disguised as Plato, and his own portrait just over here in a black beret surrounded by mathematicians. So of course, these artists remain important to any consideration of the Renaissance, and they all feature in the book, but they don't give us the whole picture. I felt it was important, now actually crucial, to reinstate the overlooked women artists from this period and explore art networks that show how Renaissance artists connected with artists in Asia and Africa. So we're going to look at one example of this network first. This network saw the Venetian Gentile Bellini work alongside the Persian artist Sinan Beg in Constantinople, now Istanbul, in 1480. Gentile Bellini traveled to Constantinople from Venice as part of ongoing peace negotiations. These two cities had been at war for 15 years and the coffers were empty for Venice. Bellini was one of Venice's leading artists, so it was a big sacrifice for the city to send him, but he was sent to paint the portrait of the Sultan, Sultan Mehmet II. So we see the Sultan in front of us now, wrapped in a very heavy red kaftan and a sleeveless fur coat, wearing the turban that all Ottoman men wore, the red felt cap wound with a white cloth. Bellini's employed the Renaissance technique, the very new scientific technique of perspective, not altogether successfully, but he creates a parapet or a balcony from which the Sultan sits behind to give the Sultan some space, as if we're looking literally into a window on another world, the Sultan's world. Now I want you to compare it to this work. This is a work by Sinan Beg. So Sinan Beg was a Persian artist. He doesn't make use of Renaissance perspective in the way that Bellini does. But the face, look at the face. The face is as characterful, I think, as Bellini's. He has the Sultan here sniffing a rose. Almost as if he's been looking at Western naturalism, even though he's a Persian miniature painter by trade. The body, however, looks much more like a body from Persian miniatures. It's folded into the available space with a disregard for realism, really, if the focus is on the flat folds and the form. I wonder if the two artists interacted at court. Here's another example. This is a beautiful drawing by Bellini called Seated Scribe from the same trip to Constantinople, now Istanbul. And here we see the scribe, the writer, cross-legged in a velvet robe, wearing a turban. He's got a solid presence. We can see this is painted by a Western artist, well-versed in naturalism and Renaissance skills. But yet, look how flat the surface of the robe is. And look at the Arabic lettering on the right. This artist, I think, was knowledgeable of Persian and Turkish miniature painting too. Now compare it to a painting from the same time by the artist Sinan Beg. And you can see how these artists were playing off each other, or certainly playing off examples of Western and Eastern art. Here in Sinan Beg's version, we see it's a lot flatter with solid blocks of color. But look at the face. Again, the face is modeled very naturalistically, like an Italian portrait, perhaps. I think it's important to see this. There's not a one-way influence here. These artists learned from one another and were influenced by one another. Bellini returned home to Venice in 1481, and he may have been struck by the similarities between Constantinople and Venice. They were both vast trading centers, of course, thronged with people from different cultures who spoke many languages. The Greek Cardinal Bessarion offered high praise to Venice when he called it another Byzantium, Byzantium being the old name for Constantinople. This is an example of Gentile Bellini's paintings from Venice a little bit later, and this shows Venice's central square, the Piazza San Marco. We can see behind it the Byzantine Basilica, which is just here, and over here to the right, the Doge's Palace, which is really a mix of Gothic and Islamic architecture. And if we look, there's this giant procession goes round the whole square, but over here, not really paying any attention, there are 4 Greek merchants standing chatting. And right over here, there are 3 men in turbans standing in front of the basilica. If we look to the far left, we can also just about make out Persian rugs hanging over the balconies that flank the square. And although you can't see it in my slide, in the original, you can see 2 women veiled in the Islamic veil. We're just going to quickly look at another German Renaissance painter, Albrecht Dürer, just to get an idea of this network that artists were involved in. Dürer spent time in Venice when he was younger, but he settled in Nuremberg in Germany, where he was from. He also traveled to the Netherlands and became friends with the Portuguese trade secretary in Antwerp. And so he bought works from the Portuguese trade secretary that will have been traded in those networks we saw in Benin between the Portuguese and African artists. And this is something similar to what Dürer bought. It's an African salt cellar. Jura was also in Brussels when Moctezuma's treasure was looted by the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortes and shown to the whole of Europe. So you can just see how connected these artists were with the world beyond Europe's borders. We have to remember the Renaissance wasn't a neat period in Italian art history. It was an awakening that spiraled across Europe from the late 13th century with the artists like Giotto and Cavallini and their renewed interest in naturalism, all the way to the late paintings of Titian, who created them for Philip II in Spain. But the Renaissance also saw the establishment of women artists. And this is a work by Plautilla Nelli, who painted biblical scenes, and this is a Last Supper, of course. Plautilla Nelli entered the Dominican convent of Santa Caterina in Florence, aged just 14. She taught herself to paint by looking at art that was on public view in the city, and she became the prioress of her convent. She ran a team of artists, and they painted works for merchants and religious centers, so she was a very significant figure. This Last Supper is unbelievably 7 meters wide, and is very important today because it's the first known Last Supper by a woman artist. It was painted in 1568, so right at the tail end of the Renaissance. And it was installed appropriately in the convent's refectory, so where the nuns would eat. So they would eat and reflect on Jesus's Last Supper in a relatively simple staging. They may be mesmerized by that beautiful tablecloth, but really they would be looking at the religious message of this painting. Italian women artists really flourished at the tail end of the Renaissance, despite the odds stacked against them. They couldn't train in the workshops of male artists or study in the new academies. They had to be taught privately at home, like this artist, a wonderful artist, Sofonisba Anguissola. In this painting, a self-portrait, she is in her early 20s and already working as a successful artist. She came from a large family of artists. Several of her sisters were artists, and she was very ambitious, as was her father. So her father sent her drawings when she was a teenager to Michelangelo, the great famous Michelangelo. Her father sent a drawing of a laughing girl, and Michelangelo responded with a challenge. Okay, it's fine, you can do a laughing girl, but can you do a crying boy? So she took her brother, who was very young at the time, as a model, and her sister, who had a basket, and in the basket, the boy poked his finger in, and this was the result. In the basket was a crayfish or a lobster, and the boys will be boys, put his finger in the basket, and the crayfish snipped his finger, and he pulled his finger out. And you can see in this drawing how she's captured the pain and the shock and the horror on the little boy's face, his sort of frown appearing on his brow and his nose wrinkled in pain. Michelangelo was very impressed. He gave this drawing with a drawing of his own to Cosimo de' Medici, his patron in Florence. And this drawing entered the collection of Fulvio Orsini, who was librarian to a powerful cardinal, Cardinal Farnese in Rome. The reason that's important is it was later seen by Caravaggio, who responded with his own interpretation. And this is Caravaggio's Boy Bitten by a Lizard from around 1595, 40 years later. So you can see how important Anguissola was both in her lifetime and afterwards. She was highly skilled in capturing fleeting emotions, and this is her chess game from 1555. Here we see 2 of her sisters, Minerva and Lucia, playing chess, while a younger sister, Europa, watches on. This is the laughing girl from the drawing that Michelangelo has sent. Minerva raises her right hand in protest, but Lucia is looking out at us, making sure we're watching her before she makes her move. Now, has she got a hand on the queen? In Italy, the rules in chess had recently changed to create an all-powerful queen, the game we know today and play. Now, I've asked chess experts if her hand is on the queen because I really wanted it to be, but they cannot come to any conclusions. So that just has to exist in our imagination. Paintings like this brought Anguissola to the attention of Philip II of Spain, and she moved to his court in 1559, just as Titian was painting his final giant masterpieces for the king. Anguissola painted all the royal family and ended her days in Palermo, painting well into her 90s, when Anthony van Dyck met her just the year before she died and sketched this drawing of her before he painted her. Conquistadours was taught privately at home, but other artists such as Artemisia Gentileschi could enter the studio. Gentileschi could enter her father's studio because he was a painter. So Orazio Gentileschi was one of Caravaggio's friends, and he became an ardent follower, known as a Caravaggisti. This is an example of a painting by Caravaggio full of drama. It's from 1599. It's called Judith Beheading Holofernes, and you can see how he uses dark black shadows and dramatic lighting to create an almost theatrical event. So you can just imagine Artemisia Gentileschi as a young woman, a young painter, deciding to take Caravaggio on at his own game. A decade after this work was done, just a bit longer, she painted the same subject. I'm going to read another extract from the book to explain why this was significant. So we can see Caravaggio's painting on the left and Gentileschi's on the right. Gentileschi's time in Florence secured her reputation as an exceptional painter. She responded to the work of Caravaggio and created paintings that were very physical and real. Taking a subject painted by Caravaggio in 1599, Judith Beheading Holofernes, she reinterpreted it, giving far more credibility to the Jewish widow Judith as she slices through the neck of the drunk Assyrian general Holofernes, a man about to destroy a hometown of Bethulia. In Gentileschi's first version, Holofernes lies on a bed, his head towards the viewer, with Judith and her maid Abra the only other figures in the dark tent. Knowing that a woman such as Judith could not match the strength of a combat soldier, Gentileschi has the maid pin him down as Judith draws the sword across his throat. Judith grasps a handful of his hair with her left hand and pulls and twists at the blade, one knee on the bed for counterbalance. In her painting, Gentileschi transfers the energy Caravaggio gave to the dying Holofernes to the two women who murder him. Within a year, the 20-year-old Gentileschi had painted the scene again. So these are both by Gentileschi, these paintings. In it, she gave even more force to Judith, who now twists her whole body behind the lengthened sword. Blood stains the sheets and spurts up from his neck, splattering her arms, dress, and breasts. Gentileschi doesn't hold back from showing what an active woman's body looks like. Judith's brow is furrowed and her chin is doubled as she strains with the blade, her breasts crushed and rolled inside her bodice as she turns. You can't help feeling Gentileschi spent time in front of a mirror, studying herself in this pose to make the scene as realistic as possible. I don't know if any of you saw the recent exhibition of her work at the National Gallery in London, but this underlined her significance as an artist, not just as a great woman artist, but of one of the best European painters of the 17th century. Europe remained under the spell of Renaissance and classical art, paintings like these, into the 19th century. But throughout this time, some artists used their voices to support change or expose injustice. This is a large painting, 7 meters wide, by the young French artist Theodore Géricault. It's vast and it's passionate. It's called The Raft of the Medusa, and it won the gold medal in the 1819 French Salon. He painted it in a frenzy, took him less than a year. And his studio at this time was quite smelly because he took body parts from cadavers, from dead bodies, so he could paint the rotting flesh in an authentic manner. It's based on an 1816 disaster when the French frigate Medusa ran aground on the coast of Senegal. The officers took the lifeboats and they abandoned the crew, 150 crew and passengers, on a makeshift raft. This raft drifted for 13 days before a passing ship saw it and rescued the people on it. And at that point, only 15 people survived. So in Géricault's dramatic version, we can see African soldiers, Mediterranean sailors, pale French corpses, and they build to this crescendo of a bare-chested black man waving a red flag, like a makeshift flag, trying to attract the tiny sail that you can just make out on the horizon. It's a ship, but it's sailing past them and they won't be spotted. If you see their own sail, it's taking them in the other direction. So when this won the gold medal at the Salon, the French government didn't buy it immediately. They normally did buy the gold medal work. So why was this? Was it because there was a black man as in the key position? At this time, France had resumed its participation in the slave trade after briefly halting it at the turn of the century. One of the key figures in the temporary abolition of slavery in France was this man, Jean-Baptiste Bellay. He was painted by Anne-Louis Girodet and this painting was exhibited at the 1798 Salon in Paris. Bellay was a child slave from Senegal who'd been freed after years of labor, but he served in the French Revolutionary Army and became deputy in the National Convention, the interim French Parliament after the French Revolution. He represented the French colony of Saint-Domingue in modern-day Haiti, and he was present when the convention abolished slavery in French colonies in 1794. He stands as if he were back in Saint-Domingue. We can see it in the landscape at the background, and he leans against the bust of Abbé Raynal, an early white advocate for the abolition of slavery who just died. Another artist whose work was in the Salon at around the same time is Marie Guillaume Benoit. So her portrait of Madeleine made her reputation when it was exhibited in the 1800 Salon. She painted a young black woman who sits and looks directly at us in a white robe with an orange sash. And what made this stand out was it was unprecedented to have a black sitter as a subject. There were black people had been painted in art, but they'd been a role as a slave or an exotic royal member of the royal family. But here was Madeleine sitting in her own right. Was she, for Benoit, was she symbolic of Mother France because France was now newly liberated from the monarchy? Or was it because the country had abolished slavery? Or did she signify emancipation for women, for black people? Or was it just a liberated portrait? Unfortunately for Benoit, liberation didn't last long. Despite winning Salon medals, she was forced to give up painting when her husband was promoted. And slavery, sadly, was reintroduced by Napoleon in 1802. In America, slavery wasn't abolished until 1865. This was the year the sculptor Mary Edmonia Lewis traveled to Europe from America. She was a daughter of an African-American father and a Native American mother, and she'd been subject to many prejudices in America. She raised the funds to travel by selling busts of Civil War heroes and medals of abolitionists, and she traveled to Rome, the home to a sculptor called Harriet Hosmer and a group of American women artists who appreciated the climate where women could work unimpeded by gender or color. Hosmer wrote, "Here, every woman has a chance if she is bold enough to avail herself of it." This is a sculpture by Edmonia Lewis called Forever Free from 1867, and it was made 2 years after slavery was abolished. In white marble, she portrays a black man naked except for his shorts, holding up his left fist to the sky, and from it we can see hanging the shackles of slavery. The woman at his side echoes his gaze, has her hands clasped in prayer. In some respects, America hardly changed in the years since Mary Edmonia Lewis left. It maintained a segregated society and racial tension ran high. It also experienced great poverty in the late 1920s as the Great Depression hit. I think if we have an image of this time in our minds, it's possibly this painting, which is Grant Wood's American Gothic from 1930. Or it might be the work of Edward Hopper. Hopper's paintings were equally well known, and he enjoyed enormous success in the 1930s. For the Great Depression fueled a desire for an authentic, realistic art of America. Hopper's world was one of cramped New York apartments, late-night cafes, and empty cinemas, and it had widespread appeal, but it showed the growing alienation of modern American life. However, there's another vision of America, much less well known, I think, that also has connections to the Great Depression. And this is the Migration series of Jacob Lawrence. So this is a series of 60 paintings that are now housed in the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Phillips Collection in Washington, DC. They're not polished or refined, but they are raw and powerful works. The Great Migration saw 6 million African American people move from the rural South America to the northern industrial cities for work. Migration was fueled by drought and disease. It destroyed crops and livelihoods of the poor tenant farmers, and they moved from around World War I right the way to 1970. Jacob Lawrence was an African American artist and grew up in Harlem. He saw these families move into New York, move up from the South, and he listened to their stories. And this series, the 60 panels, was his response. This is his first painting in the series. And these figures aren't portraits, they're anonymous people. But the reason for doing that is that they could stand in for any one of the 6 million people who were making this move from the South to the North. We can see them pushing through gateways to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, trying to get away, have a better life. Each painting that Lawrence did was accompanied by a caption. And these captions laid out the reality of the migration. So this is panel 1 and this is panel 10. And clearly showing people staring at empty bowls. The people left the South because they had to, but not because they wanted to. And they moved up to the North and found the cities not particularly welcoming. They often faced segregation. And if white people were in the series, they were in positions of power or involved in racist abuse. Ultimately, however, the series ends with a hopeful note. There were more opportunities for education, and one of the final paintings in the series says, in this painting, in the North, they had the freedom to vote. Another African-American artist who exposed ongoing racism was Elizabeth Catlett. She was a sculptor, and she also made prints. Her series, The Black Woman, was highly charged, and this is a lino cut again by Matt Pringle. This print shows her inking the plate before she rolls it through the printing press. I think we'll join her in the studio now. Catlett's 15 prints are lino cuts, like the illustrations for this book. She made them by cutting into linoleum, a flooring material that offers artists a cheap and quick alternative to carving into wood. She used simple compositions to maximize the impact of her figures. 4 women sit on a bus behind a sign saying "colored only." In another, a man lies dead, a rope around his neck, 3 men hanged above him. Catlett has given her prints individual titles that together tell a story of the injustices faced by Black women, from social segregation on the bus in I Have Special Reservations to the brutal murder of husbands, brothers, and fathers in And a Special Fear for My Loved Ones. Now Catlett looks at this print as I Have Given the World My Songs, the 5th print in the series. A woman bends over a guitar, her face lined with sorrow. Catlett has printed a blue edge to the guitar, suggesting that the woman is playing the blues, and she has reason to. Her memories float behind her, also printed in blue, and show a burning crucifix and a Black man being cudgeled by a white man who wears the distinctive hooded costume of the Ku Klux Klan. Catlett was an incredible woman. She grew up in Washington, D.C. and wanted to be an artist despite there being few African-American women artists working professionally at this time. She grew up with racial segregation so bad that African-Americans still couldn't go to museums, but she circumnavigated that. And when she was teaching, she would take her students while the museums were closed. The last print in her series, I think, expresses her desire for the future. My right is a future of equality with other Americans. So I want to end today with a quick trip to the present, to the global contemporary art world. The art we see around us today now embraces every medium and every scale. It's made by all genders, all ethnicities, and exists in a global environment, both physical and digital. The last chapter in my book is titled Art as Resistance, and it brings together art from all over the world that challenges current thinking. It features post-colonial artists from Australia and New Zealand, America and Britain. It includes artists exposing persecution in their home countries of South Africa and Uganda. And it includes artists tackling the world's hottest topic, climate change. British artists Heather Ackroyd and Dan Harvey explore environmental concerns in their joint practice. They've created ice sculptures in the Arctic and grown crystals over the skeletons of stranded whales. They've even made coats from living grass that are now worn by Extinction Rebellion activists and shared on Instagram to draw attention to climate change. The Icelandic-Danish artist Olafur Eliasson transported 12 chunks of the Greenland ice sheet that had broken off to Copenhagen in 2014. This was to coincide with the publication of a major United Nations climate report. Every second, 10,000 tons of ice is lost in Greenland because of climate change. Ice Watch was arranged like a clock in City Hall Square, where the blocks slowly melted, a reminder of what climate change is doing to the Arctic. This final chapter in the book on art and resistance opens at the Louvre in Paris. The scene is an unusual one for the world-famous museum because it's the staging of a pop video. Now, why, you may think, did I include this in a book about art? Because the video highlighted art that could change how we saw and how we thought. I'm going to read you a tiny extract. It is late May 2018, and the gallery is completely empty except for two people standing in front of a painting. It isn't just any painting. It's Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, one of the most famous paintings in the world. And they aren't just any people. They are Beyonce and Jay-Z, wife and husband, two of the biggest musical artists on the planet. They stare calmly, directly at the camera, looking at you, looking at them. Slowly, they turn to look at each other, and then at the Mona Lisa. Her fame has led to a life cooped up in a bulletproof glass box, the star of thousands of photos a day. Beyonce and Jay-Z, by comparison, are fully in control of their fame. This video presents them as all-powerful, able to empty this usually packed gallery and claim it for themselves. They have filmed the Louvre's priceless art collection from a new perspective, highlighting the black sailor at the top of the raft, the Medusa, the black woman who posed for Benoit, ancient Egyptian art taken from Africa. Napoleon now crowns Queen Bey instead of Josephine. Jay-Z takes his place on Jericho's raft and is rescued. A new art history sparks into life. Beyonce and Jay-Z curated the Louvre collection in a new way in their video, creating a new path into art. Footfall at the museum went up 25% as visitors followed bespoke trails that highlighted the art featured in the video, art we've looked at today, Benoit's portrait of Madeleine and Jericho's raft, the Medusa. With the making of this video, Beyonce and Jay-Z became part of a global movement to retell history with the blinkers removed, to offer new perspectives and fresh approaches. Just last week, Black women artists Sonia Boyce and Simone Lee both won coveted Golden Lion Awards at this year's Venice Biennale. They are proof of the ongoing impact of this global movement. Thank you. I'm going to end the slides and then hopefully we've still got time for questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So we do have some time for any questions from the audience. So if people have questions, please feel free to either type them out in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I'd be happy to call on you and unmute you so that we can have some time to interact directly with Charlotte here. Okay, got a question?
Oh, hi. I'm really interested in the Persian arts, and I think it's kind of mysterious to me because I think one of the most notable characteristic of the Persian art is diversity, because it like incorporates of many Chinese maybe traditional strategies or all kinds of patterns from the Western, like the Rome and the Greece. So I'm really wondering that whether like the diversity means it doesn't really have its own style or characteristic, just as others like other art do, like African art, like Greek art. When you mention them, you will have some impressions or some certain features of them, but when when it comes to the Persian art, I have not much idea.
I think you're right that they were influenced by lots of cultures around them. But I think actually, if you look at Persian miniature painting, they stand very distinctly from European Renaissance painting, for example. The examples I showed quite a difference, didn't they, between those two styles. I think Persian miniature painting, or certainly at the court of the Sultan, there were so many different artists of all different from all different cultures that you're right, you couldn't help but be influenced. But I think that's the same, or something I learned writing this book, that's the same for all artists in all countries. It's very difficult to actually put a label on someone because of where they're physically, geographically living. So in the Renaissance, there were artists who had come from all over Italy, but also further afield. So although we think of them as Italian Renaissance artists now, then perhaps not. So going back to Persian art, I think Persia was a vast empire, but it could touch on, draw from Indian art, from European Renaissance art. So you're right, it has a more of a feel of a melting pot, that artists were influenced by different cultures, but I don't think that's a negative really for it. I think that's almost its strength.
I guess what people are thinking of when I'll ask one. So, obviously the main thrust of your book is to focus on women and, other people that have sort of been left out of the narrative. So I'm just curious how you went about finding these people and these artworks that have been left out, right? Because they've been left out for so long. That is it the case that they just have been like selected out of what we consider canon, and they've always been there, just everybody ignored them? Or did it take a lot of detective work to actually track down a lot of these pieces?
I have to say the detective work has largely been done by other people, thankfully. But what hasn't happened, I don't think, to this point, is it hasn't been knitted together back into the main story. So the books I showed you at the beginning, the really big fat tomes on art history, the male writers who took that on, I think for simplicity's sake, if as much as anything else, streamlined art. It's much easier to tell a story if you cut out a lot of things and go, right, we're just going to tell the story of these artists. So whether it's conscious or unconscious bias, these artists had disappeared. But the women I've put in the book, I don't want anyone to think that they're in there just because they're women. So these artists at the time when they were painting were maybe the only women, maybe one or two women in an all-male academy, but they still managed to get voted in, or they were buried, even though Elisabetta Serrani, for example, in 17th century Bologna in Italy, she was buried with the highest honors that the city could give her, the same honors that the male artist who was the top of his game was buried with. She was only 27 when she died. So you just see how much the city valued her at the time. But I mean, have you heard of Elisabetta Serrani? She's not that well known. She's certainly not up there with Guido Reni, who was the artist that she actually was buried in his tomb. So they were literally buried together. I think a lot of these artists were written about have since the 1970s started to have their histories written. But the thing I found was that they're often written in books on women art, or there may be fantastic books on African art, or even Persian art, going back to your question, but they haven't been pulled into that central Western art story that historically has prioritized white male artists. So that the obvious people that you would expect to find in a history of art are in this book. So like we do have Leonardo and Michelangelo and hopefully all your favorites, Van Gogh, Van Dyck. But I wanted to put them alongside these other artists to show that there's a broader art history out there if we go looking for it.
Fantastic. There's a question in the chat box which asks, what was the influence of Chinese ink paintings on Western paintings?
That's a really good question. I think the influence kind of came the Chinese ink paintings influenced Japanese artists, and the Japanese prints that Japanese artists made hugely influenced Western art in the 19th century. So before then, it's interesting because Western art will be taken by, we might call them explorers or merchants, but in the imperialist West kind of marching on the rest of the world. They would take British or European paintings with them and try and influence the world that way, and would bring things back, but they were often exhibited as being exotic or different. Chinese art influenced Britain in the 18th century with a kind of fashion for design and chinoiserie. But I would say the art itself, it was clearly heavily influenced Japanese style of painting. That influenced Japanese printmaking, and that was imported in the 1850s, 60s into Paris particularly. And those Japanese prints completely revolutionized how Western artists saw. So yes, it's not a direct influence, I would say, but there's definitely an influence there.
All right, one last chance for people with questions. Well, if not, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. For those of you guys that are interested, again, this is the book. It's fantastic. There are pictures and everything in there, so good chance to expand your understanding of the many narratives of art that need to be told. And so thank you again, Charlotte, for joining us. Thank you everybody for joining us. One last thing, which is our tradition here, which is at the end of a talk, we do like to ask people to turn on their webcams so that we can take a group picture. And I'll unmute everybody so that they can thank you personally.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.